Our project team is excited to tell you a bit about what we've learned over the past 3 years as we've engaged young people in conversations and research about their civic and character development as part of the Roots of Engaged Citizenship project. This study is aimed at understanding how young people grow into the kinds of civically minded adults who positively contribute to their communities, help others around them, and participate in solving social issues. This 3-year mixed method study was made possible through the generous support of a grant from the John Templeton Foundation. Our presentation today is organized in 3 parts and around a series of questions. I'll begin by talking a bit about how we define civic engagement, how it intersects with character development, and why we think an intentional focus on the civic lives of young people is critical not only to their own well-being, but also to the well-being of our communities. Erin and Laura will then provide some background, data, and action steps for 4 strategies shown to promote civic values and behaviors. And then in closing, we'll highlight where you can find more information about this research. We've also embedded polls throughout today's presentation to gather insights and feedback from the audience. To get us started, what is civic engagement? And in the spirit of getting our audience involved right away, we want to hear your thoughts. So using the question box in the lower right-hand corner, we want to know, what is the very first thing you think of when you hear the words civic engagement? What's the first image or word that pops into your mind? Okay, so we're seeing responses like volunteering, democracy, voting, service, a lot of volunteering, voice, citizenship, caring about your community, social action, service to others, making a difference, protesting, the word political. Excellent. Well, thank you for sharing. Interestingly, when we asked a similar question to kids in grades 4 through 12 in our study, we actually got fairly similar answers. They talked a lot about service to people, service to the community, service to the environment, voting, connection to the community. These were all things kids identified good citizens as doing. So in our work, we define civic engagement as consisting of behaviors, values, attitudes, and knowledge related to political and social issues. We also take the position that civic engagement is deeply rooted in kids' day-to-day lives. Because there's many forms of civic engagement, we chose to focus on 4 of them today: volunteering, environmental behavior, following the news, and social responsibility values. So why study this in children and adolescents? This is an important question, and it's been getting a lot more attention over the last few decades. So we have this stereotype of what young people, particularly adolescents, spend all of their brain power thinking about. So things like themselves, being in love, what's happening on Facebook. And while there might be a glimmer of truth in this sometimes, what we don't see in images like this are things like caring about others, concern about their own future or that of their neighborhood or the planet, or a commitment to important social causes and issues. Yet, when you sit down to truly engage young people and solicit and listen to their ideas, many kids are thinking about exactly those kinds of things, some at a fairly early age. Now, we don't just magically acquire a civic identity the day the government declares us eligible to vote. All of this starts in childhood and begins on the playground, around the dinner table, and in out-of-school time activities. And it's the intentional nurturing of civic values and behaviors in those settings that we want to highlight today. So why do we think civic engagement is so important? Of course, civic engagement is important in its own right as the health of our democracy depends on the participation of its citizens. But we also know that civic engagement is related to some important developmental outcomes for kids and their communities. For example, A growing body of research shows that civic engagement, especially actions that involve direct interaction with and helping other people, is associated with better health for those who are engaged. For instance, a recent study of adolescents published in the journal Pediatrics found that civic engagement boosted cardiovascular health and was related to reduced stress, while another study found that civic engagement is related to increases in life satisfaction, sense of purpose, and positive emotions. So put simply, we feel good when we're doing things that help others and contribute to our community. There's also a number of recent studies showing that adolescents who are civically engaged perform better in school, both in terms of grades and test scores, as well as motivation to learn and engagement in classes. It might be that civic engagement helps young people connect their studies to real-world problems and see the broader purpose of succeeding academically. So where does character fit into this whole discussion of civic engagement? Well, we define character strengths as positive individual attributes and skills like perseverance, leadership, and gratitude that vary in expression and level across individuals. These are also the kinds of strengths that arise mostly through experiences at home, in school, and with friends, and thus can be intentionally cultivated. So when you think about character strengths like future-mindedness or teamwork, it's easy to see how character strengths give youth valuable skills, attributes, and motivations required for civic engagement. So while it's possible and likely that supportive context predicts civic engagement directly, we'll also show some evidence from our data that suggests that one way supportive context promotes civic engagement is through the building of character strengths like perseverance, teamwork, and future-mindedness. So our emphasis today is both on how to promote civic engagement directly as well as through character development. So to show us some of the ways our data suggests we can do this with intention, I'm going to turn the presentation over to my colleague, Aaron.
Thank you, Amy. As Amy was discussing, our research team has been investigating strategies for enhancing youth civic and character development. Today we're going to discuss 4 separate strategies for accomplishing that goal. Discussing civic issues, providing opportunities through organized activities, modeling civic behaviors, and building supportive relationships with caring adults. For each of these strategies, as Amy mentioned, we're going to provide an introductory overview and some background research. Then we'll present some initial hot-off-the-press findings from our own data and study. We'll end our discussion of each strategy by briefly introducing some ways that providers can potentially engage in and initiate each strategy for youth. We're going to discuss these strategies using data from our Roots of Engaged Citizenship project. The central goal of this project is to investigate the ways in which supportive contexts, developmental competencies, and youth's own character strengths promote the development of those civic outcomes that Amy was just discussing, including civic behaviors, skills, and values. Our study included multiple phases. In early phases, we were focused on survey development through semi-structured and cognitive interviews with youth. Some of the quotes that Amy shared and that Laura will be sharing later on in the study come from those interviews. Next, we surveyed youth and many of their parents. Currently, we are completing a second wave of data collection, which will allow us to examine longitudinal change in our primary constructs. Our survey sample was comprised of 2,475 youth in grades 4 through 12 and 865 of their parents. A unique aspect of the study is that participants reside in 3 geographic regions, including Southern California, a large metropolitan area in Minnesota, and a rural county in West Virginia. The sample was both ethnically and socioeconomically diverse. As I had said previously, our primary goal today is to discuss actionable strategies for enhancing youth civic and character development. The first strategy that I'm going to talk about is discussing civic-related topics with youth. Research on youth political development has consistently found that parents' political and civic communication is positively related to their children's own political attitudes and behavior. Similarly, research on civic education has found that teachers can influence youth's civic knowledge and understanding. When teachers talk to their kids about current events, politics, or social issues, they help stress the importance of those topics. Such discussions also give youth the opportunity to actively contribute to discussions at home and in the classroom that help enhance their own civic development by voicing their own opinions. As Amy just discussed, civic engagement includes a wide range of behaviors and beliefs, and discussions of civic topics can be equally diverse. In our study, we were interested in the range of civic messages youth receive from both teachers and parents, and the frequency with which those socialization agents discussed these topics. Our study asked youth to report on how often, with their parents and in their classrooms, youth had discussions that were focused on politics and current events, potential problems facing their communities, and discussions of injustice, people were being treated unfairly. One of our initial questions focused on where youth are having discussions on these topics. However, we were curious to hear what you think. Where do you think youth are having the most discussions about politics and current events?
Thanks, Aaron. I just launched the poll for people to take. As Aaron said, the question is, who talks to kids more about politics and current events? And the two options are parents or teachers. So it looks like about 63% of you have had a chance to vote, so we'll leave it open a few more seconds so a few more people can say what they think. All right, it looks like about 80% have voted, so I'm going to close the poll now and share the results. And you'll see that it says that 28% of you think parents talk to kids more about politics and current events, and 72% say teachers. So I'll hand it back over to you, Aaron.
Right, and it looks like our participants' responses were actually in line with the data that we found. We get back into the slides here. It was actually kind of surprising to us because several of the primary investigators in our project had anticipated that these discussions might be more frequent in homes. But as you can see from this figure, discussions of politics and current events did take place more often with teachers, according to youth, than with parents. However, families are equally important contexts for discussing topics related to other civic-related things such as injustice or issues of people being treated unfairly or problems facing the communities where the families reside. In addition, parents are important socialization agents for discussing issues related to political and community participation, specifically those messages that stress what types of activities citizens should be engaged in. To illustrate this point, I'm going to present data from our survey of parents. So these are parent responses, and as you can see, the green, blue, and red figures represent the percentage of parents who agreed with those statements out of 10. So as you can see, only 1 out of 10 parents tell their children that it is best not to get involved with politics or that protests don't accomplish anything. And only 2 out of 10 parents tell their children that people in the community need to help themselves. So most parents are actually discussing the importance of civic and community involvement with their children. So how do we talk to youth about civic topics? Well, we know from some of the research that we're doing in other studies that these discussions of civic-related topics do not often come up naturally in family discussions. However, it's important to stress that civic discussions do not necessarily need to be all about politics, political issues, or candidates. Instead, getting kids to discuss the issues facing their communities or pointing out examples of injustice can lead to discussions about different ways of addressing those issues through civic and political action. So, our first bit of advice is to be on the lookout for opportunities to discuss these topics. Such opportunities may, arise while visiting a local park in need of repair or watching television shows where characters are being treated unjustly. However, the prolonged election season that we're looking forward to, with its endless commercials for candidates and issues, can also provide, obviously, a nice opening for some politically related discussions. It's also important to choose the right words when you speak to your child and speak at their level. Now, this is obviously something that parents and youth workers already do very well, but discussing complicated political and social issues in a way that children can understand may require some forethought, and extra patience as youth struggle with difficult political and civic concepts. Finally, it's important that civic discussions are not a one-way street, but rather give youth ample opportunities to express their own opinions in developing beliefs. Our research has found, as Amy pointed out, that even young children can have fairly strong opinions about political issues and civic action, and allowing youth to freely discuss their views can have a strong positive effect on their developing political identity. This also means that caring adults should be open to sharing their own views with youth, but focusing on gentle guidance rather than forcing specific views and advantages. The second strategy that I'm going to discuss is providing opportunities for youth to develop civically through engagement in organized activities. Developmental research has consistently found that engagement in productive activities outside of school and outside of the home is a strong predictor of positive youth outcomes. This is especially true of youth's engagement in structured or organized activities, such as extracurricular activities like academic clubs or sports through schools. Also community clubs, and organizations, or religious groups. Enhanced civic engagement and lead to the enhanced development of those character strengths that Amy was discussing earlier. However, while we know that organized activities lead to positive outcomes, our research has really focused on why these links exist. Developmental scientists have theorized that it is vital for youth to engage in quality organized activities. In our study, we directly measured the quality of youth's organized activity involvement by asking youth to report on the types of experiences those activities provide. So our data actually our survey, I should say, actually directly assessed two facets of the quality of organized activity involvement, including whether organized activities provided opportunities for civic development and also whether those activities provided opportunities for personal growth. Specifically, we asked youth, when you spend time in organized activities outside of normal school hours, how often are those activities allowing you to make changes in your community, learn about political or social issues, or opportunities to volunteer to help others? In terms of personal growth, we asked youth whether their organized activities provided opportunities to learn about themselves, learn skills that are useful outside of the activity, and engage in an activity that they are passionate about or care a lot about. Asking these questions is going to allow us to take a closer look at the specific ways or mechanisms through which youth involvement leads to positive outcomes. Also, by examining the quality of youth's organized involvement, we can explore the specific civic and personal growth experiences that are associated with different types of organized activities. We found that in our own data that when youth were engaged in sports, they were more likely to state that their engagement in organized activities allowed them an opportunity to engage in things over which they had a lot of passion, and also provided opportunities to learn new skills that they could apply outside of the activities. Community clubs and organizations was most strongly tied to opportunities to create community change or important changes in their community, while church and religious activity was most strongly linked to opportunities to volunteer or engage in community service. Interestingly, and a little bit surprisingly to us, arts and music involvement was most strongly linked with opportunities to learn about politics. So this was this type of engagement in arts and music activities was most strongly linked with the quality of participating in discussions and learning more about politics. Now, in future research, we're going to investigate these links more thoroughly. However, the main message here is that just like our previous discussion of parents and teachers providing unique types of civic discussions, different organized activities may provide unique opportunities for specific civic experiences, as well as enhance specific dimensions of personal growth. So why does this matter? Well, we've also investigated the association between these types of organized activity qualities and civic engagement and character development. We know that the involvement associated with civic engagement and character development. However, these associations are explained or mediated by the quality of youth's involvement. Thus, our data indicates that simply getting youth involved may not be enough for really enhancing civic and character development, but rather that involvement needs to be in activities that are supplying both civic and personal growth quality experiences. So as I said above, a primary take-home message in application is that quality matters. It's important for adults to be monitoring the activities their children are involved in and examining whether those activities are providing opportunities for civic development and personal growth, because we know that both aspects of the qualities of organized activity involvement are important for enhancing civic and character development. It's also important to note that if such opportunities are absent or aren't present in the activities that youth are engaged in, it may be important for coaches, group leaders, and even parents to think about ways of incorporating these qualities into the activity. This may include pointing out specific skills that youth are gaining from their engagement in those activities, or maybe getting the group or team involved in a civic or volunteering activity. Now, a lot of teams and organizations already have volunteering or civic components as part of their activity, but monitoring the activities to make sure those types of things are present, as well as providing those opportunities for youth, seems to be a way of enhancing the types of experiences youth are getting from those organized activities. Finally, our data indicate that different activities may provide unique opportunities for development. So it may be important for youth to engage in a range of activities. Now, I know it can be very difficult for families to get kids to multiple activities throughout the week. I mean, I myself have daughters that are 4 and 6, and they're only 4 and 6, but I'm already feeling like we're pulled in 6 different directions throughout the week to get my daughters to their different activities. Plus, it can be even harder for parents of older adolescents, as their activities can become even more time-intensive, and the competitiveness of engaging in those activities can be stronger, so it can be harder to maintain engagement in a lot of different activities with age. However, despite these obstacles, our data seem to indicate that providing youth with different types of activities may be essential for providing the well-rounded experiences that will lead to greater civic engagement and the development of core character strengths. So I'm going to pass the discussion on to Laura, who's going to continue our discussion of strategies for enhancing civic character development.
Thank you, Aaron. So I'm going to tell you about the third strategy that we want to present to you today, which is modeling civic behaviors. So when we think about modeling is a strategy that's rooted in the ideas of social learning theory. And this theory states that children imitate or emulate the behavior of people who are important to them, like their parents, for example. And while it is important to ask both parents and young people what parents are involved in, we find that young people have to perceive that their parents are civically involved in order to emulate this behavior. So that's why we asked the young people themselves 4 questions about their parents' civic behaviors. And what we found is that youth viewed their parents primarily as voters, although 31% said that parents followed the news often or very often, and youth were less likely to report that their parents volunteered or that they were involved in actively. Our data are also showing that parents' modeling of civic behavior is positively associated with youth civic engagement. So when young people's parents are more civically engaged, young people are more likely to report volunteering, social responsibility values, and following the news. And this is a finding from our study, but that supports a lot of other work that's come before us. So the question is, how do you effectively model civic behavior? And we're going to give you some suggestions, and some of these might seem incredibly obvious to you, and they are. But with everyone's busy schedules, these tips just remind us to be more intentional about enacting some of these strategies. Our findings are focused on parents modeling, but certainly other adults in children's lives can also be effective, positive role models and enact these same strategies. So our first suggestion is to volunteer with your child or the youth that you work with. Doing these activities together is a great opportunity to have fun. It's an opportunity for bonding, and it's also the best way for youth to see you walking the talk and engaging in a way that you think is important. These kinds of activities can also offer opportunities for civic discussion, which is a strategy that Aaron just talked to us about. And this is all well and good, of course, but many parents and other adults rightly wonder, how do you find these opportunities? The trouble is often not the desire to volunteer, but how to find ways to make a difference that you and your kids will find meaningful. So some of our suggestions are don't be afraid to reach out to local organizations. Local organizations would probably be overjoyed to hear from potential volunteers. But there are so many different opportunities available, so it might be helpful to pick out a project or a cause that matters to your family or to your students. Maybe it's helping animals, maybe it's working with senior citizens, maybe it's feeding the homeless or protecting the environment. We have a suggestion to visit the website Generation On, which is a great website that has lots of examples of projects you can do and even start up yourself. And then our last bit of advice there is just to be spontaneous in your helping. Serving others or engaging in civic actions doesn't have to necessarily be organized or formal. It doesn't have to be long or involved. You could pick up a trash bag and head out to clean up a local park or do something to help a neighbor. And then our second suggestion for effectively modeling civic behavior is capitalizing on the little moments. So we are being watched by the young people around us. The way that we treat others probably does not go unnoticed by the young people who watch us. Even in little moments throughout the day, going the extra mile to show concern for others or exhibit fairness and equality might rub off. And that's how it was for one 11-year-old girl who we asked about how parents communicate to her about how to treat other people. And she shared a story with us about how her mom stood up to her boss when coworkers were being treated unfairly. And these kinds of everyday actions can make a really big impression on young people. So now we want to hear your opinions. We have another poll for you. And the question is, why do you think kids don't always emulate their parents' civic behaviors? Do you think it's because they don't see it, so they don't see what their parents are doing? They don't feel supported by their parents? They don't know how to engage? They don't realize it's important? Or some other reason?
Thanks, Laura. It looks like close to half of people have voted. So I'll leave it open for a little bit longer. All right, it looks like about 70% have had a chance to weigh in. So I'm going to close the poll here in a few seconds, so if you hadn't had a chance to vote, please do. All right, I'm closing the poll now. And the results show that 29% say they don't see it, 8% say they don't feel supported, 21% says they don't know how, 33% say they don't realize it's important, and 9% said for some other reason. Thank you all for making your voices heard.
Thank you, Sam. And yeah, thank you for voting. This is a really interesting spread of results here because I think the two biggest were not realizing it's important and not seeing it, also not knowing how. One thing that's interesting about this poll is that all of these reasons are likely operating to some extent. Our study is finding some evidence for the support idea. That youth might not feel supported, and that might be why they don't emulate their parents' behaviors. So I'm going to explain this to you as I tell you about the fourth strategy we want to present of building supportive relationships with youth. So first, what do we mean by support? Well, when adults cultivate supportive relationships with youth, they respect their opinions, they listen to show they care, they give positive feedback and encourage youth to succeed, and they build trusting relationships and close connections with youth. In our study, we measured youth's perceptions of supportive relationships with both their parents and their teachers. And there's a lot we could say about supportive relationships and how important they are. Perhaps you've even seen some of Search Institute's other recent webinars that go into much more depth in terms of support. But today we want to make two main points. The first point we want to make is that supportive relationships are necessary but insufficient for fostering civic engagement. And what do we mean by that? What we mean is that these supportive relationships are necessary for youth because youth need to feel cared for and feel supported to have their relational needs met before they can care for and help others. But at the same time, our data also show that having supportive relationships without any of the other strategies is ineffective for fostering civic engagement. So what we're finding is that youth who report high support from parents and teachers, but who have low levels of the other three strategies, which are modeling, communication or discussions, and opportunities in extracurriculars, these youth have the lowest rates of civic engagement compared to youth whose parents or teachers did one or more of the other strategies. So in other words, like I said before, supportive relationships may be inefficient by themselves in cultivating good citizens. And this makes sense, right? There are many parents and teachers who have positive supportive relationships with youth, but who are not necessarily directly emphasizing civic engagement in the process. Our second related point is that supportive relationships enhance the effectiveness of other strategies that we've talked about today. And to give you an example, let's go back to the figure on modeling that I showed earlier. So this figure you've seen before. It's a little bit different because it has environmental behaviors, and then you see these mysterious orange lines. So what I want to illustrate here is that this modeling to environmental behaviors and social responsibility values is enhanced when parents are supportive. So in other words, for social responsibility values and environmental behaviors, modeling was only effective in the context of having supportive relationships with parents. And I'm going to give you an example of that with environmental behavior. So these bars represent environmental behaviors of youth who have different combinations of high and low civic modeling from parents and high and low supportive relationships from parents. So what you see in this figure with the bar on the right-hand side is clearly that the environmental behaviors are highest among the youth who report that their parents model civic behaviors and who offer support in their relationships. So what does this mean? It means that children and adolescents are probably more likely to emulate their parents when their parents respect and support them. Feeling more supported from parents, so feeling listened to, feeling trusted, may increase youth's desire to want to be like their parents. So what's the takeaway here? We all want to be supportive to the youth around us, and there are many different ways to do that. But our suggestion is that by adding a few intentional habits to our interactions with young people, we may be able to optimize the support that we're providing to them. So one recommendation we have is to check out the parentfurther.com website. This is a wonderful site with lots of great resources geared to parents, but it's also relevant for any adults who work with young people on a day-to-day basis. So what you can do on this site is you can take quizzes to self-evaluate the types of support you're offering youth and get personalized feedback and strategies for further enhancing the ways that you think about supporting young people. So in our last segment here, we've talked about the 4 strategies that cultivate civic engagement, and now you're probably wondering how these all work together. So in concluding, we want to make 2 final points about the 4 strategies. One is that they do indeed all work together, and 2 is that they're broadly relevant. So they're relevant to skills and thriving in youth's lives in ways that go way beyond civic engagement. And so we want to highlight that. So here's an example. We compared civic engagement of young people who had all the strategies that we talked about, and those are the bars on the left, who had some of the strategies that we talked about, and who just had supportive relationships from parents and teachers. So that's the relationships only block. And what you can see from this figure is that youth who reported having all the strategies, so all the strategies were parents modeling, civic discussions in classes and at home, opportunities in extracurriculars, and supportive relationships from parents and teachers. These young people had higher levels of all of the civic engagement measures that we examined. And they were much higher than youth who only reported having a few strategies or youth who reported having only positive relationships. And also, as we mentioned already, an important thing we've learned in this project is that these same strategies foster character strengths. In fact, the way that these strategies likely work to support civic engagement is in part through building character. So this figure is very similar to the one I just showed you, but focuses on 3 character strengths: future-mindedness, perseverance, and teamwork. And again, what we see here is that having all of the strategies that we talked about today is related to having the highest level as compared to having only some or only the relationships. So in conclusion, it might seem overwhelming to think about doing everything we talked about today, so thinking about implementing all these strategies, but what we want to underscore is that a lot of these strategies go together naturally. So by being a little bit more intentional and taking advantage of small opportunities, adults in the lives of youth can do these strategies synergistically. And here's just one example. Imagine a teacher who's in class with students discussing a social issue such as the environment. After this discussion of environmental issues, she leads the children in an environmental action such as planting trees in the community. And during this activity, the teacher takes the opportunity, since they're outside of class, to really get to know the kids on a one-on-one basis and further build these supportive relationships. So through this one series of activities, the teacher led discussions, modeled civic action, and built supportive relationships. So in conclusion, we hope you've learned more today about some of the strategies that you can do and encourage others to do to help youth reach their full potentials in terms of character and civic engagement.
Wonderful. Thanks, Laura. Well, if you are interested in learning more about this project and the findings as they come out, I want to encourage you to check out our project website, which is civicroots.org. And our website is designed to provide updates to participating schools and families on the status of the study, as well as serve as a forum to share important findings from our longitudinal data. And I was hoping to show you the actual website. Oh, there we go. So our homepage has links to all of the website content. It also includes a short video describing the study to participating families, news and updates, and links to our partner institutions. And then on the top, under the Research tab, you can find additional information about their study design, some white papers we've written on preliminary findings that we've been sharing with our community partners, as well as under the Papers and Presentations tab is sort of a repository for all of our published papers and conference presentations, which you're able to download directly from the site. On the top, if you're interested in knowing more about our team, you can find information about each of the principal investigators, as well as the amazing pool of research assistants and research associates who've been working with us in making this project possible. And then the For Parents tab includes information for parents about their child's participation in the study. Also, I'll mention at the bottom is a Contact Us tab, and in there you'll be able to find phone numbers and email addresses for each member of our team if you want to follow up with us after this to offer a reaction, advice, a link, ask a question. We invite you to do that as well. So in the spirit of asking questions, I'm going to turn it back over to Sam, and she has been fielding questions from the audience throughout the presentation, and she will direct them to the presenters.
Thank you, Amy. Yeah, we've had a ton of questions and comments come in, so thank you all so much for your participation. If we don't get to your question or comment in the next 10 minutes that we have left, don't worry, we see them, we read them. As Amy said, you're absolutely welcome to follow up with our researchers and send them emails about what your thoughts are about the presentation today. So to start with, I'll just start with Amy. And someone asked, were youth with special needs included in the research as part of the sample?
Yeah, that's a good question. We didn't ask specifically about whether kids had special needs, but our study did take place in a variety of classrooms across the 16 or 17 schools, but mostly mainstream classrooms, social studies, English, Phi-Ed, art classes. So to the extent that those children were involved in the mainstream classrooms, absolutely, they were involved, but I can't really speak beyond that since we didn't ask them specifically.
Great. Thanks, Amy. The next question I'll just send to Erin. And of course, Laura and Amy, you can feel free to chime in as well. But the question is, have you looked at the levels of support and guidance from teachers versus parents and the outcomes on youth? For example, a teacher is very active in addressing all 4 strategies, but parents are not. What happens in these cases?
I think that's an incredibly interesting question, and we're working toward looking at that sort of specificity. And I think that some of the models that we're going to be building are going to be looking at not only which socializing age of teachers versus parent, but which of the facets of the the socialization, the modeling, the communication, or the support, which are most important. Then again, specifically, which are most important for different types of socialization agents. Off the top of my head, and maybe Laura or Amy can correct me if I'm wrong, I don't believe we have that specific finding yet, but it's a very interesting question. It definitely be one of the research questions we'll be examining as we move forward.
I would just chime in to say Erin's exactly right that we really do want to look at that. I think we have been seeing a little bit of preliminary evidence with thinking about how the strategies work together. So for example, when we look at youth who have teacher support only with some other strategies but not parent support, that's related to some civic outcomes, but parent support has to be there. Something we want to understand a little bit more, but it does seem like the teacher and the parent support might serve different purposes for the young person.
Thank you, Erin and Laura. The next question I'm going to send to Amy, and it's about the role of technology in this research, and if the study looked into how technology affects civic engagement.
Mm-hmm. That's an important question in an area where there's a lot of really active research programs happening at this time. We, of course, when we were asking kids about different ways they get engaged, we were, of course, using different forms of technology like Facebook, blogs, signing e-petitions, things like that. We have yet to analyze that data, but I will mention that there is a lot of really cool research happening in this area around sort of online forums and online sort of collaborations that are happening between young people around social causes. And I'll also mention to the audience the website civicyouth.org, which is run by Circle at Tufts University, a great resource if you want to learn more about the role of technology in civic engagement. They're producing a lot of real-time research in that area.
Great. The next question I'll send over to Laura. This question is, did you find any significant differences between children in rural or urban contexts when you did your research?
You know, that is also a wonderful question. We intentionally had that geographic diversity when we designed the study, so we made sure we had areas as well as suburban areas and metropolitan or urban areas. We're moving into that phase too. I think we have the plan to look at that, but right now we are focused mostly on sort of the main findings, and we're really excited to dive in to see some of those differences. So that's something to be on the lookout for, maybe for a future webinar.
Thank you, Laura. The next question I'll direct to Erin. And the question is there a plan to look more into the effects that extracurricular programs have on youth civic engagement?
Yes, actually, that is one of our initial questions. We're working on a paper that Amy's actually leading. That's directly looking at how engagement in organized activities, including extracurriculars through schools and community organizations and religious organizations, is related to different civic outcomes. And we have, and actually that project is looking at how character strengths help mediate or explain the why those organized activities and extracurricular activities are supportive of civic outcomes. And I don't know if, Amy, you want to comment a little bit more on that paper that we're just starting to do analyses on.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really, it's just so important to be looking at some of these quality indicators, because so often we just think participation results in really good things, but it's really what's happening in those contexts, and really unpacking it for different kinds of kids too, I think is important. And so please, yes, certainly that will be posted on our website as those results become final.
Great, and Amy, I'll just have you keep talking. I'll direct the next question to you. And what effects do peers have on youth becoming engaged? And will negative opinions from peers work against young people's decision to become engaged in spite of parents and teacher support?
Mm-hmm. Well, we know that peers are incredibly persuasive and influential in young people's actions, as well as shaping their attitudes and values, particularly in adolescence. And so that is another, we did not talk about that today, but another big part of our research is focusing on the role of peers, particularly in the middle school and high school context, because we think that peers are uniquely positioned to both support and maybe in some cases deter young people from getting engaged civically. Although there's a lot of research when you ask kids, like, why did you get involved? It's often because, well, my friend asked me to, right? So a friend is inviting them to come along to a volunteer experience or an out-of-school time activity. And so maybe it's my own worldview that young people are really a positive influence on one another. But this is actually a space that hasn't been studied a lot, of the role of peers in promoting the civic engagements of one another, but certainly something that we'll be examining because we think it's quite important.
All right, the next question, I think I'm going to send this one over to Laura. Since you talked a little bit about how adults can be a model civic engagement, the question is, are there any ideas or suggestions for changing adults' mindset regarding youth participation, which might turn into being an obstacle for building civic engagement?
That's a really good question. I think our presentation hinted at that a little bit when Erin presented some of those findings about messages against civic engagement that that parents might give. And so I guess on the one hand, it's encouraging in our study that very few parents were reported giving those messages, but that doesn't mean those mindsets aren't out there. And I think for those families who are giving kind of anti-engagement messages, I think there would be an obstacle for the young person in terms of getting involved. I guess the other thing I would say about that is we really view a lot of these processes as bi-directional, and what that means is that young people can influence their parents just as much as parents can influence the young people. And today we mostly focused on what adults can do, but I think in the case where parents might be anti-civic engagement or resistant to certain kinds of activities, the young person might have an opportunity to engage their parents in conversation and over time sort of build that understanding or shared understanding about why something's important. But with all that, I would agree that there's a big challenge there for parents or other adults who don't necessarily endorse civic engagement as much.
Thank you, Laura. One last question I'm going to send over to Erin. And that question we've already touched on a little bit during this time, but just a little bit more about where is this research going in the future? Are there plans for the Roots of Civic Engagement project to go forward?
Great question. Yeah, we're definitely excited about the next steps in the project. I briefly mentioned that the current phase of the study is to collect data, especially on our youth who took the survey, took the Wave 1 survey. We primarily presented data from the first wave of data collection, and we're now collecting data, a second wave of data, and we have plans in the works to follow these youth over time, which I think will position us to provide some kind of new information on some of these processes, how they change all the way from 4th grade all the way through 12th grade, middle childhood all the way through adolescence. In addition, we have plans to include some different measurement strategies, including teacher reports and school-level report data in subsequent waves. And as we've mentioned in terms of a lot of the great questions we had related to specific questions in our data, we have a lot of great questions in the works and papers in the works that are going to address how all of these variables relate together, and then when we have the data in place, look at how these things and processes change over time. So in the inclusion of additional measurement strategies and different measurements, as well as thinking in terms of how demographic differences and geographic differences can influence and moderate these associations, I think is on the horizon for our project.